Lotka-Volterra equations. The Lotka-Volterra equations, also known as the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, are a pair of first-order nonlinear differential equations, frequently used to describe the dynamics of biological systems in which two species interact, one is a predator and the other is prey. The populations change through time according to the pair of equations, where the variable x is the population density of prey, for example, the number of rabbits per square kilometer. The variable y is the population density of some predator, for example, the number of foxes per square kilometer, and represent the instantaneous growth rates of the two populations. T represents time. The prey's parameters, alpha and beta, describe, respectively, the maximum prey per capita growth rate, and the effect of the presence of predators on the prey death rate. The predator's parameters, gamma, delta, respectively describe the predator's per capita death rate, and the effect of the presence of prey on the predator's growth rate. All parameters are positive and real. The solution of the differential equations is deterministic and continuous. This, in turn, implies that the generations of both the predator and prey are continually overlapping. 1. The Lotka-Volterra system of equations is an example of a Kolmogorov population model, not to be confused with the better-known Kolmogorov equations, 2, 3, 4, which is a more general framework that can model the dynamics of ecological systems with predator-prey interactions, competition, disease, and mutualism. Biological interpretation and model assumptions. The prey are assumed to have an unlimited food supply and to reproduce exponentially, unless subject to predation. This exponential growth is represented in the equation above by the term alpha x. The rate of predation on the prey is assumed to be proportional to the rate at which the predators and the prey meet. This is represented above by beta xy. If either x or y is 0, then there can be no predation. With these two terms, the prey equation above can be interpreted as follows. The rate of change of the prey's population is given by its own growth rate minus the rate at which it is preyed upon. The term delta xy represents the growth of the predator population. Note the similarity to the predation rate. However, a different constant is used, as the rate at which the predator population grows is not necessarily equal to the rate at which it consumes the prey. The term gamma y represents the loss rate of the predators due to either natural death or emigration. It leads to an exponential decay in the absence of prey. Hence the equation expresses that the rate of change of the predator's population depends upon the rate at which it consumes prey, minus its intrinsic death rate. The Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model makes a number of assumptions about the environment and biology of the predator and prey populations. 5. 1. The prey population finds ample food at all times. 2. The food supply of the predator population depends entirely on the size of the prey population. 3. The rate of change of population is proportional to its size. 4. During the process, the environment does not change in favor of one species, and genetic adaptation is inconsequential. 5. Predators have limitless appetite. 6. Both populations can be described by a single variable. This amounts to assuming that the populations do not have a spatial or age distribution that contributes to the dynamics. Biological relevance of the model. Numbers of snowshoe hare, yellow, background, and Canada lynx, black line, foreground furs sold to the Hudson's Bay Company. Canada lynxes eat snowshoe hares. None of the assumptions above are likely to hold for natural populations. Nevertheless, the Lotka-Volterra model shows two important properties of predator and prey populations, and these properties often extend to variants of the model in which these assumptions are relaxed. First, Lotka-Volterra equations. The Lotka-Volterra equations, also known as the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, are a pair of first-order nonlinear differential equations, frequently used to describe the dynamics of biological systems in which two species interact, one is a predator and the other is prey. The populations change through time according to the pair of equations, where the variable x is the population density of prey, for example, the number of rabbits per square kilometer. The variable y is the population density of some predator, for example, the number of foxes per square kilometer, and represent the instantaneous growth rates of the two populations. T represents time. The prey's parameters, alpha and beta, describe, respectively, the maximum prey per capita growth rate, and the effect of the presence of predators on the prey death rate. The predator's parameters, gamma, delta, respectively describe the predator's per capita death rate, and the effect of the presence of prey on the predator's growth rate. All parameters are positive and real. The solution of the differential equations is deterministic and continuous. This, in turn, implies that the generations of both the predator and prey are continually overlapping. 1. The Lotka-Volterra system of equations is an example of a Kolmogorov population model, not to be confused with the better-known Kolmogorov equations, 2, 3, 4, which is a more general framework that can model the dynamics of ecological systems with predator-prey interactions, competition, disease, and mutualism. Biological interpretation and model assumptions. The prey are assumed to have an unlimited food supply and to reproduce exponentially, unless subject to predation. This exponential growth is represented in the equation above by the term alpha x. The rate of predation on the prey is assumed to be proportional to the rate at which the predators and the prey meet. This is represented above by beta xy. If either x or y is 0, then there can be no predation. The Lotka-Volterra system of equations is an example of a Kolmogorov population model, not to be confused with the better-known Kolmogorov equations 2, 3, 4, which is a more general framework that can model the dynamics of ecological systems with predator-prey interactions, competition, disease, and mutualism. Biological interpretation and model assumptions. The prey are assumed to have an unlimited food supply and to reproduce exponentially, unless subject to predation. This exponential growth is represented in the equation above by the term alpha x. The rate of predation on the prey is assumed to be proportional to the rate at which the predators and the prey meet. This is represented above by beta xy. If either x or y is 0, then there can be no predation. With these two terms, the prey equation above can be interpreted as follows. The rate of change of the prey's population is given by its own growth rate minus the rate at which it is preyed upon. The term delta xy represents the growth of the predator population. Note the similarity to the predation rate. However, a different constant is used, as the rate at which the predator population grows is not necessarily equal to the rate at which it consumes the prey. The term gamma y represents the loss rate of the predators due to either natural death or emigration. It leads to an exponential decay in the absence of prey. Hence the equation expresses that the rate of change of the predator's population depends upon the rate at which it consumes prey, minus its intrinsic death rate. The Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model makes a number of assumptions about the environment and biology of the predator and prey populations. 5. 1. The prey population finds ample food at all times. 2. The food supply of the predator population depends entirely on the size of the prey population. 3. The rate of change of population is proportional to its size. 4. During the process, the environment does not change in favor of one species, and genetic adaptation is inconsequential. 5. Predators have limitless appetite. 6. Both populations can be described by a single variable. This amounts to assuming that the populations do not have a spatial or age distribution that contributes to the dynamics. Biological relevance of the model. Numbers of snowshoe hare yellow, background, and Canada lynx black line, foreground furs sold to the Hudson's Bay Company. Canada lynxes eat snowshoe hares. None of the assumptions above are likely to hold for natural populations. Nevertheless, the Lotka-Volterra model shows two important properties of predator and prey populations, and these properties often extend to variants of the model in which these assumptions are relaxed. Firstly, the dynamics of predator and prey populations have a tendency to oscillate. Fluctuating numbers of predators and prey have been observed in natural populations, such as the lynx and snowshoe hare data of the Hudson's Bay Company, 6, and the moose and wolf populations in Isle Royale National Park. 7. Secondly, the population equilibrium of this model has the property that the prey equilibrium density, given by, depends on the predator's parameters, and the predator equilibrium density, given by, on the prey's parameters. This has as a consequence that an increase in, for instance, the prey growth rate, leads to an increase in the predator equilibrium density, but not the prey equilibrium density. Making the environment better for the prey benefits the predator, not the prey. This is related to the paradox of the pesticides and to the paradox of enrichment. A demonstration of this phenomenon is provided by the increased percentage of predatory fish caught had increased during the years of World War I, 1914-18, when prey growth rate was increased due to a reduced fishing effort. A further example is provided by the experimental iron fertilization of the ocean. In several experiments, large amounts of iron salts were dissolved in the ocean. The expectation was that iron, which is a limiting nutrient for phytoplankton, would boost growth of phytoplankton and that Nevertheless, the Lotka-Volterra none of the assumptions above are likely to hold for natural populations. Nevertheless, the Lotka-Volterra model shows two important properties of predator and prey populations, and these properties often extend to variants of the model in which these assumptions are relaxed. Firstly, the dynamics of predator and prey populations have a tendency to oscillate. Fluctuating numbers of predators and prey have been observed in natural populations, such as the lynx and snowshoe hare data of the Hudson's Bay Company, 6, and the moose and wolf populations in Isle Royale National Park. 7. Secondly, the population equilibrium of this model has the property that the prey equilibrium density, given by, depends on the predator's parameters, and the predator equilibrium density, given by, on the prey's parameters. This has as a consequence that an increase in, for instance, the prey growth rate, leads to an increase in the predator equilibrium density, but not the prey equilibrium density. Making the environment better for the prey benefits the predator, not the prey. This is related to the paradox of the pesticides and to the paradox of enrichment. A demonstration of this phenomenon is provided by the increased percentage of predatory fish caught had increased during the years of World War I, 1914-18, when prey growth rate was increased due to a reduced fishing effort. A further example is provided by the experimental iron fertilization of the ocean. In several experiments, large amounts of iron salts were dissolved in the ocean. The expectation was that iron, which is a limiting nutrient for phytoplankton, would boost growth of phytoplankton and that it would sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The addition of iron typically leads to a short bloom in phytoplankton, which is quickly consumed by other organisms, such as small fish or zooplankton, and limits the effect of enrichment mainly to increased predator density, which in turn limits the carbon sequestration. This is as predicted by the equilibrium population densities of the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, and is a feature that carries over to more elaborate models in which the restrictive assumptions of the simple model are relaxed. 8. Applications to economics and marketing. The Lotka-Volterra model has additional applications to areas such as economics, 9, and marketing. 10, 11. It can be used to describe the dynamics in a market with several competitors, complementary platforms and products, a sharing economy, and more. There are situations in which one of the competitors drives the other competitors out of the market and other situations in which the market reaches an equilibrium where each firm stabilizes on its market share. It is also possible to describe situations in which there are cyclical changes in the industry or chaotic situations with no equilibrium and changes are frequent and unpredictable. History. The Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model was initially proposed by Alfred J. Lotka in the theory of autocatalytic chemical reactions in 1910. 12-13 This was effectively the logistic equation. 14 Originally derived by Pierre-François Verhulst. 15 In 1920 Lotka extended the model, via Andrei Kolmogorov, to organic systems, using a plant species and a herbivorous animal species as an example. 16 And in 1925 he used the equations to analyze predator-prey interactions in his book on biomathematics. 17 The same set of equations was published in 1926 by Vito Volterra, a mathematician and physicist, who had become interested in mathematical biology. 13, 18, 19 Volterra's enquiry was inspired through his interactions with the marine biologist Umberto d'Ancona, who was courting his daughter at the time and later was to become his son-in-law. D'Ancona studied the fish catches in the Adriatic Sea and had noticed that the percentage of predatory fish caught had increased during the years of World War I, 1914-18. This puzzled him, as the fishing effort had been very much reduced during the war years and, as prey fish the preferred catch, one would intuitively expect this to increase of prey fish percentage. Volterra developed his model to explain d'Ancona's observation and did this independently from Alfred Lotka. He did credit Lotka's earlier work in his publication, after which the model has become known as the Lotka-Volterra model. 20. The model was later extended to include density-dependent prey growth and a functional response of the form developed by C.S. Halling, a model that has become known as the Rosenzweig-MacArthur model. 21 Both the Lotka-Volterra and Rosenzweig-MacArthur models have been used to explain the dynamics of natural populations of predators and prey. In the late 1980s, an alternative to the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, and its common prey-dependent generalizations, emerged, the ratio-dependent or Arditi-Ginzburg model. 22 The validity of prey or ratio-dependent models has been much debated. 23 The Lotka-Volterra equations have a long history of use in economic theory. Their initial application is commonly credited to Richard Goodwin in 1965-24 or 1967. 25-26 Solutions to the equations. The equations have periodic solutions. These solutions do not have a simple expression in terms of the usual trigonometric functions, although they are quite tractable. 27, 28, 29. If none of the non-negative parameters alpha, beta, gamma, delta vanishes, 3 can be absorbed into the normalization of variables to leave only one parameter. Since the first equation is homogeneous in x, and the second one in y, the parameters beta, alpha and delta, gamma are absorbable in the normalizations of y and x respectively, and gamma into the normalization of t, so that only alpha, gamma remains arbitrary. It is the only parameter affecting the nature of the solutions. A linearization of the equations yields a solution similar to simple harmonic motion 30 with the population of predators trailing that of prey by 90 degrees in the cycle. A simple example. Population dynamics for rabbit and fox problem mentioned aside. Phase space plot for the predator-prey problem for various initial conditions of the predator population. Suppose there are two species of animals, a rabbit prey and a fox predator. If the initial densities are 10 rabbits and 10 foxes per square kilometer, one can plot the progression of the two species over time, given the parameters that the growth and death rates of rabbits are 1.1 and 0.4 while that of foxes are 0.1 and 0.4 respectively. The choice of time interval is arbitrary. One may also plot solutions parametrically as orbits in phase space, without representing time, but with one axis representing the number of prey and the other axis representing the densities of predators for all times. This corresponds to eliminating time from the two differential equations above to produce a single differential equation. Relating the variables x predator and y prey. The solutions of this equation are closed curves. It is amenable to separation of variables, integrating. Yields the implicit relationship, where v is a constant quantity depending on the initial conditions and conserved on each curve. An aside, these graphs illustrate a serious potential limitation in the application as a biological model. For this specific choice of parameters, in each cycle, the rabbit population is reduced to extremely low numbers, yet recovers while the fox population remains sizable at the lowest rabbit density. In real-life situations, however, chance fluctuations of the discrete numbers of individuals might cause the rabbits to actually go extinct, and, by consequence, the foxes as well. This modeling problem has been called the Atto-Fox problem, an Atto-Fox being a notional 10-18 of a fox. 31, 32 A density of 10-18 foxes per square kilometer equates to an average of approximately 5 times 10-10 foxes on the surface of the Earth, which in practical terms means that foxes are extinct. Hamiltonian structure of the system. Since the quantity is conserved over time, it plays role of a Hamiltonian function of the system. 33 To see this we can define Poisson bracket as follows. Then Hamilton's equations read. The variables and are not canonical, since. However, using transformations 34 and we came up to a canonical form of the Hamilton's equations featuring the Hamiltonian, the Poisson bracket for the canonical variables now takes the standard form. Phase space plot of a further example. A less extreme example covers. Alpha equals 2/3, beta equals 4/3, gamma equals 1 equals delta. Assume x, y quantify thousands each. Circles represent prey and predator initial conditions from x equals y equals 0.9 to 1.8, in steps of 0.1. The fixed point is at 1/2. Dynamics of the system. In the model system, the predators thrive when prey is plentiful but, ultimately, outstrip their food supply and decline. As the predator population is low, the prey population will increase again. These dynamics continue in a population cycle of growth and decline. Population equilibrium. Population equilibrium occurs in the model when neither of the population levels is changing, i.e. when both of the derivatives are equal to 0. The above system of equations yields two solutions. And hence, there are two equilibria. The first solution effectively represents the extinction of both species. If both populations are at 0, then they will continue to be so indefinitely. The second solution represents a fixed point at which both populations sustain their current, non-zero numbers, and, in the simplified model, do so indefinitely. The levels of population at which this equilibrium is achieved depend on the chosen values of the parameters alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. Stability of the fixed points. The stability of the fixed point at the origin can be determined by performing a linearization using partial derivatives. The Jacobian matrix of the predator-prey model is and is known as the community matrix. First fixed point, extinction. When evaluated at the steady state of 0, the Jacobian matrix J becomes. The eigenvalues of this matrix are. In the model alpha and gamma are always greater than 0, and as such the sign of the eigenvalues above will always differ. Hence the fixed point at the origin is a saddle point. The instability of this fixed point is of significance. If it were stable, non-zero populations might be attracted towards it, and as such the dynamics of the system might lead towards the extinction of both species for many cases of initial population levels. However, as the fixed point at the origin is a saddle point, and hence unstable, it follows that the extinction of both species is difficult in the model. In fact, this could only occur if the prey were artificially completely eradicated, causing the predators to die of starvation. If the predators were eradicated, the prey population would grow without bound in this simple model. The populations of prey and predator can get infinitesimally close to 0 and still recover. Second fixed point, oscillations. Evaluating J at the second fixed point leads to. The eigenvalues of this matrix are. As the eigenvalues are both purely imaginary and conjugate to each other, this fixed point must either be a center for closed orbits in the local vicinity or an attractive or repulsive spiral. In conservative systems, there must be closed orbits in the local vicinity of fixed points that exist at the minima and maxima of the conserved quantity. The conserved quantity is derived above to be on orbits. Thus orbits about the fixed point are closed and elliptic, so the solutions are periodic, oscillating on a small ellipse around the fixed point, with a frequency and period. As illustrated in the circulating oscillations in the figure above, the level curves are closed orbits surrounding the fixed point. The levels of the predator and prey populations cycle and oscillate without damping around the fixed point with frequency. The value of the constant of motion v, or, equivalently, k equals express minus v, can be found for the closed orbits near the fixed point. Increasing k moves a closed orbit closer to the fixed point. The largest value of the constant k is obtained by solving the optimization problem. The maximal value of k is thus attained at the stationary fixed point and amounts to, where E is Euler's number. Coevolution. In biology, coevolution occurs when two or more species reciprocally affect each other's evolution through the process of natural selection. The term sometimes is used for two traits in the same species affecting each other's evolution, as well as gene culture coevolution. The pollinating wasp Ciscolia ciliata in pseudocopulation with a flower of Ophrys speculum 1. Charles Darwin mentioned evolutionary interactions between flowering plants and insects in On the Origin of Species 1859. Although he did not use the word coevolution, he suggested how plants and insects could evolve through reciprocal evolutionary changes. Naturalists in the late 1800s studied other examples of how interactions among species could result in reciprocal evolutionary change. Beginning in the 1940s, plant pathologists developed breeding programs that were examples of human-induced coevolution. Development of new crop plant varieties that were resistant to some diseases favored rapid evolution in pathogen populations to overcome those plant defenses. That, in turn, required the development of yet new resistant crop plant varieties, producing an ongoing cycle of reciprocal evolution in crop plants and diseases that continues to this day. Coevolution is a major topic for study in nature, expanded rapidly from the 1960s, when Daniel H. Janssen showed coevolution between acacias and ants, see below, and Paul R. Ehrlich and Peter H. Raven suggested how coevolution between plants and butterflies may have contributed to the diversification of species in both groups. The theoretical underpinnings of coevolution are now well developed, e.g., the geographic mosaic theory of coevolution, and demonstrate that coevolution can play an important role in driving major evolutionary transitions such as the evolution of sexual reproduction or shifts in ploidy. 2-3. More recently, it has also been demonstrated that coevolution can influence the structure and function of ecological communities, the evolution of groups of mutualists such as plants and their pollinators, and the dynamics of infectious disease. 2-4. Each party in a coevolutionary relationship exerts selective pressures on the other, thereby affecting each other's evolution. Coevolution includes many forms of mutualism, host-parasite, and predator-prey relationships between species, as well as competition within or between species. In many cases, the selective pressures drive an evolutionary arms race between the species involved. Pairwise or specific coevolution, between exactly two species, is not the only possibility, in multi-species coevolution, which is sometimes called guild or diffuse coevolution, several to many. Species may evolve a trait or a group of traits in reciprocity with a set of traits in another species, as has happened between the flowering plants and pollinating insects such as bees, flies, and beetles. There are a suite of specific hypotheses on the mechanisms by which groups of species coevolve with each other. 5. Coevolution is primarily a biological concept, but researchers have applied it by analogy to fields such as computer science, sociology, and astronomy. Mutualism. Coevolution is the evolution of two or more species which reciprocally affect each other, sometimes creating a mutualistic relationship between the species. Such relationships can be of many different types. 6. 7. Flowering plants. Flowers appeared and diversified relatively suddenly in the fossil record, creating what Charles Darwin described as a abominable mystery of how they had evolved so quickly. He considered whether coevolution could be the explanation. 8. 9. He first mentioned coevolution as a possibility and on the origin of species, and developed the concept further in fertilization of orchids. Coevolution. In biology, coevolution occurs when two or more species reciprocally affect each other's evolution through the process of natural selection. The term sometimes is used for two traits in the same species affecting each other's evolution, as well as gene culture coevolution. The pollinating wasp Ciscolia ciliata in pseudocopulation with a flower of Ophrys speculum. 1. Charles Darwin mentioned evolutionary interactions between flowering plants and insects in On the Origin of Species, 1859. Although he did not use the word coevolution, he suggested how plants and insects could evolve through reciprocal evolutionary changes. Naturalists in the late 1800s studied other examples of how interactions among species could result in reciprocal evolutionary change. Beginning in the 1940s, plant pathologists developed breeding programs that were examples of human-induced coevolution. Development of new crop plant varieties that were resistant to some diseases favored rapid evolution in pathogen populations to overcome those plant defenses. That, in turn, required the development of yet new resistant crop plant varieties, producing an ongoing cycle of reciprocal evolution in crop plants and diseases that continues to this day. Coevolution is a major topic for study in nature expanded rapidly from the 1960s, when Daniel H. Janssen showed coevolution between acacias and ants, see below, and Paul R. Ehrlich and Peter H. Raven suggested how coevolution between plants and butterflies may have contributed to the diversification of species in both groups. The theoretical underpinnings of coevolution are now well developed, e.g., the geographic mosaic theory of coevolution, and demonstrate that coevolution can play an important role in driving major evolutionary transitions such as the evolution of sexual reproduction or shifts in ploidy. 2. 3. More recently, it has also been demonstrated that coevolution can influence the structure and function of ecological communities, the evolution of groups of mutualists such as plants and their pollinators, and the dynamics of infectious disease. 2. 4. Each party in a coevolutionary relationship exerts selective pressures on the other, thereby affecting each other's evolution. Coevolution includes many forms of mutualism, host-parasite, and predator-prey relationships between species, as well as competition within or between species. In many cases, the selective pressures drive an evolutionary arms race between the species involved. Pairwise or specific coevolution, between exactly two species, is not the only possibility, in multi-species coevolution, which is sometimes called guild or diffuse coevolution, several to many. Species may evolve a trait or a group of traits in reciprocity with a set of traits in another species, as has happened between the flowering plants and pollinating insects such as bees, flies, and beetles. There are a suite of specific hypotheses on the mechanisms by which groups of species coevolve with each other. 5. Coevolution is primarily a biological concept, but researchers have applied it by analogy to fields such as computer science, sociology, and astronomy. Mutualism. Coevolution is the evolution of two or more species which reciprocally affect each other, sometimes creating a mutualistic relationship between the species. Such relationships can be of many different types. 6. 7. Flowering plants. Flowers appeared and diversified relatively suddenly in the fossil record, creating what Charles Darwin described as a abominable mystery of how they had evolved so quickly. He considered whether coevolution could be the explanation. 8. 9. He first mentioned coevolution as a possibility and On the Origin of Species, and developed the concept further in fertilization of orchids. 1862. 7. 10. 11. Insects and insect-pollinated flowers. Honeybee taking a reward of nectar and collecting pollen in its pollen baskets from white melilot flowers. Modern insect-pollinated entomophilous flowers are conspicuously CO-adapted with insects to ensure pollination and in return to reward the pollinators with nectar and pollen. The two groups have coevolved for over 100 million years, creating a complex network of interactions. Either they evolved together, or at some later stages they came together, likely with pre-adaptations, and became mutually adapted. 12. 13. Several highly successful insect groups, especially the Hymenoptera wasps, bees and ants, and Lepidoptera butterflies and moths, as well as many types of Diptera flies and Coleoptera beetles evolved in conjunction with flowering plants during the Cretaceous, 145 to 66 million years ago. The earliest bees, important pollinators today, appeared in the early Cretaceous. 14. A group of wasps sister to the bees evolved at the same time as flowering plants, as did the Lepidoptera. 14. Further, all the major clades of bees first appeared between the Middle and Late Cretaceous, simultaneously with the adaptive radiation of the eudicots, 3/4 of all angiosperms, and at the time when the angiosperms became the world's dominant plants on land. 8. At least 3 aspects of flowers appear to have co-evolved between flowering plants and insects, because they involve communication between these organisms. Firstly, flowers communicate with their pollinators by scent. Insects use this scent to determine how far away a flower is, to approach it, and to identify where to land and finally to feed. Secondly, flowers attract insects with patterns of stripes leading to the rewards of nectar and pollen, and colors such as blue and ultraviolet, to which their eyes are sensitive. In contrast, bird-pollinated flowers tend to be red or orange. Thirdly, flowers such as some orchids mimic females of particular insects, deceiving males into pseudocopulation. 14. 1. The yucca, Yucca whippley, is pollinated exclusively by Tegaticula maculata, a yucca moth that depends on the yucca for survival. 15. The moth eats the seeds of the plant, while gathering pollen. The pollen has evolved to become very sticky, and remains on the mouth parts when the moth moves to the next flower. The yucca provides a place for the moth to lay its eggs, deep within the flower away from potential predators. 16. Birds and bird-pollinated flowers. Purple-throated carib feeding from and pollinating a flower. Hummingbirds and ornithophilous bird-pollinated flowers have evolved a mutualistic relationship. The flowers have nectar suited to the birds' diet, their color suits the birds' vision, and their shape fits that of the birds' bills. The blooming times of the flowers have also been found to coincide with hummingbirds' breeding seasons. The floral characteristics of ornithophilous plants vary greatly among each other compared to closely related insect-pollinated species. These flowers also tend to be more ornate, complex, and showy than their insect-pollinated counterparts. It is generally agreed that plants formed coevolutionary relationships with insects first, and ornithophilous species diverged at a later time. There is not much scientific support for instances of the reverse of this divergence, from ornithophily to insect pollination. The diversity in floral phenotype in ornithophilous species, and the relative consistency observed in bee-pollinated species can be attributed to the direction of the shift in pollinator preference. 17. Flowers have converged to take advantage of similar birds. 18. Flowers compete for pollinators, and adaptations reduce unfavorable effects of this competition. The fact that birds can fly during inclement weather makes them more efficient pollinators where bees and other insects would be inactive. Ornithopily may have arisen for this reason in isolated environments with poor insect colonization or areas with plants which flower in the winter. 18. 19. Bird-pollinated flowers usually have higher volumes of nectar and higher sugar production than those pollinated by insects. 20. This meets the birds' high energy requirements, the most important determinants of flower choice. 20. In mammulas, an increase in red pigment in petals and flower nectar volume noticeably reduces the proportion of pollination by bees as opposed to hummingbirds, while greater flower surface area increases bee pollination. Therefore, red pigments in the flowers of Mammullus cardinalis may function primarily to discourage bee visitation. 21. In penstemon, flower traits that discourage bee pollination may be more influential on the flower's evolutionary change than pro-bird adaptations, but adaptation towards birds and away from bees can happen simultaneously. 22. However, some flowers such as Heliconia angusta appear not to be as specifically ornithophilous as had been supposed. The species is occasionally 151 visits in 120 hours of observation visited by Trigona stingless bees. These bees are largely pollen robbers in this case, but may also serve as pollinators. 23. Following their respective breeding seasons, several species of hummingbirds occur at the same locations in North America, and several hummingbird flowers bloom simultaneously in these habitats. These flowers have converged to a common morphology and color because these are effective at attracting the birds. Different lengths and curvatures of the corolla tubes can affect the efficiency of extraction in hummingbird species in relation to differences in bill morphology. Tubular flowers force a bird to orient its bill in a particular way when probing the flower, especially when the bill and corolla are both curved. This allows the plant to place pollen on a certain part of the bird's body, permitting a variety of morphological co-adaptations. 20. Ornithophilous flowers need to be conspicuous to birds. 20. Birds have their greatest spectral sensitivity and finest hue discrimination at the red end of the visual spectrum. 20. So red is particularly conspicuous to them. Hummingbirds may also be able to see ultraviolet colors. The prevalence of ultraviolet patterns in nectar guides in nectar-poor entomophilous, insect-pollinated flowers warns the bird to avoid these flowers. 20. Each of the 2 subfamilies of hummingbirds, the Phaethornithinae hermits and the Trochilinae, has evolved in conjunction with a particular set of flowers. Most Phaethornithinae species are associated with large monocotyledonous herbs, while the Trochilinae prefer dicotyledonous plant species. 20. Fig reproduction and fig wasps. A fig exposing its many tiny matured, seed-bearing gynoecia. These are pollinated by the fig wasp. Blastophaga psns. In the cultivated fig, there are also asexual varieties. 24. The genus Ficus is composed of 800 species of vines, shrubs, and trees, including the cultivated fig, defined by their syconia, the fruit-like vessels that either hold female flowers or pollen on the inside. Each fig species has its own fig wasp which, in most cases, pollinates the fig, so a tight mutual dependence has evolved and persisted throughout the genus. 24. Pseudomyrmex ant on Bullthorn Vachellia cornigera, with Beltian bodies that provide the ants with protein. 25. Acacia ants and acacias. The acacia ant, Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, is an obligate plant ant that protects at least 5 species of Acacia, Vachellia, from preying insects and from other plants competing for sunlight, and the tree provides nourishment and shelter for the ant and its larvae. 25-26 Such mutualism is not automatic. Other ant species exploit trees without reciprocating, following different evolutionary strategies. These cheater ants impose important host costs via damage to tree reproductive organs, though their net effect on host fitness is not necessarily negative and, thus, becomes difficult to forecast. 27-28 Hosts and parasites. Parasites and sexually reproducing hosts. Host-parasite coevolution is the coevolution of a host and a parasite. 29 A general characteristic of many viruses, as obligate parasites, is that they coevolve alongside their respective hosts. Correlated mutations between the two species enter them into an evolution arms race. Whichever organism, host or parasite, that cannot keep up with the other will be eliminated from their habitat, as the species with the higher average population fitness survives. This race is known as the Red Queen hypothesis. 30 The Red Queen hypothesis predicts that sexual reproduction allows a host to stay just ahead of its parasite, similar to the Red Queen's race in Through the Looking Glass. It takes all the running you can do, to keep in the same place. 31 The host reproduces sexually, producing some offspring with immunity over its parasite, which then evolves in response. 32 The parasite-host relationship probably drove the prevalence of sexual reproduction over the more efficient asexual reproduction. It seems that when a parasite infects a host, sexual reproduction affords a better chance of developing resistance through variation in the next generation, giving sexual reproduction variability for fitness not seen in the asexual reproduction, which produces another generation of the organism susceptible to infection by the same parasite. 33, 34, 35 Coevolution between host and parasite may accordingly be responsible for much of the genetic diversity seen in normal populations, including blood plasma polymorphism, protein polymorphism, and histocompatibility systems. 36. Brood parasite, Eurasian reed warbler raising a common cuckoo. 37. Brood parasites. Brood parasitism demonstrates close coevolution of host and parasite, for example in some cuckoos. These birds do not make their own nests, but lay their eggs in nests of other species, ejecting or killing the eggs and young of the host and thus having a strong negative impact on the host's reproductive fitness. Their eggs are camouflaged as eggs of their hosts, implying that hosts can distinguish their own eggs from those of intruders and are in an evolutionary arms race with the cuckoo between camouflage and recognition. Cuckoos are counter-adapted to host defenses with features such as thickened eggshells, shorter incubation so their young hatch first, and flat backs adapted to lift eggs out of the nest. 37, 38, 39. Antagonistic coevolution. Antagonistic coevolution is seen in the harvester ant species Paganomyrmex barbatus and Paganomyrmex rugosus, in a relationship both parasitic and mutualistic. The queens are unable to produce worker ants by mating with their own species. Only by crossbreeding can they produce workers. The winged females act as parasites for the males of the other species as their sperm will only produce sterile hybrids. But because the colonies are fully dependent on these hybrids to survive, it is also mutualistic. While there is no genetic exchange between the species, they are unable to evolve in a direction where they become too genetically different, as this would make crossbreeding impossible. 40. Predators and prey. Predator and prey, a leopard killing a bushbuck. Predators and prey interact and coevolve, the predator to catch the prey more effectively, the prey to escape. The coevolution of the two mutually imposes selective pressures. These often lead to an evolutionary arms race between prey and predator, resulting in anti-predator adaptations. 41. The same applies to herbivores, animals that eat plants, and the plants that they eat. Paul R. Ehrlich and Peter H. Raven in 1964 proposed the theory of escape and radiate coevolution to describe the evolutionary diversification of plants and butterflies. 42. In the Rocky Mountains, red squirrels and crossbills, seed-eating birds, compete for seeds of the lodgepole pine. The squirrels get at pine seeds by gnawing through the cone scales, whereas the crossbills get at the seeds by extracting them with their unusual crossed mandibles. In areas where there are squirrels, the lodgepole's cones are heavier, and have fewer seeds and thinner scales, making it more difficult for squirrels to get at the seeds. Conversely, where there are crossbills but no squirrels, the cones are lighter in construction, but have thicker scales, making it more difficult for crossbills to get at the seeds. The lodgepole's cones are in an evolutionary arms race with the two kinds of herbivore. 43. Sexual conflict has been studied in Drosophila melanogaster, shown mating, male on right. Competition. Both interspecific competition, with features such as sexual conflict, 44, and sexual selection, 45, and interspecific competition, such as between predators, may be able to drive coevolution. 46. Interspecific competition can result in sexual antagonistic coevolution, an evolutionary relationship analogous to an arms race, where the evolutionary fitness of the sexes is counteracted to achieve maximum reproductive success. For example, some insects reproduce using traumatic insemination, which is disadvantageous to the female's health. During mating, males try to maximize their fitness by inseminating as many females as possible, but the more times a female's abdomen is punctured, the less likely she is to survive, reducing her fitness. 47. Multispecies. Long-tongued bees and long-tubed flowers coevolved, whether pairwise or diffusely, in groups known as guilds. 48. The types of coevolution listed so far have been described as if they operated pairwise, also called specific coevolution, in which traits of one species have evolved in direct response to traits of a second species, and vice versa. This is not always the case. Another evolutionary mode arises where evolution is reciprocal, but is among a group of species rather than exactly two. This is variously called guild or diffuse coevolution. For instance, a trait in several species of flowering plant, such as offering its nectar at the end of a long tube, can co-evolve with a trait in one or several species of pollinating insects, such as a long proboscis. More generally, flowering plants are pollinated by insects from different families including bees, flies, and beetles, all of which form a broad guild of pollinators which respond to the nectar or pollen produced by flowers. 48, 49, 50. Geographic mosaic theory. Mosaic coevolution is a theory in which geographic location and community ecology shape differing coevolution between strongly interacting species in multiple populations. These populations may be separated by space and/or time. Depending on the Mosaic coevolution is a theory in which geographic location and community ecology shape differing coevolution between strongly interacting species in multiple populations. These populations may be separated by space and/or time. Depending on the ecological conditions, the interspecific interactions may be mutualistic or antagonistic. 51. In mutualisms, both partners benefit from the interaction, whereas one partner generally experiences decreased fitness in antagonistic interactions. Arms races consist of two species adapting ways to one up the other. Several factors affect these relationships, including hot spots, cold spots, and trait mixing. 52. Reciprocal selection occurs when a change in one partner puts pressure on the other partner to change in response. Hot spots are areas of strong reciprocal selection, while cold spots are areas with no reciprocal selection or where only one partner is present. 52. The three constituents of geographic structure that contribute to this particular type of coevolution are natural selection in the form of a geographic mosaic, hot spots often surrounded by cold spots, and trait remixing by means of genetic drift and gene flow. 52. Mosaic, along with general coevolution, most commonly occurs at the population level and is driven by both the biotic and the abiotic environment. These environmental factors can constrain coevolution and affect how far it can escalate. 53. Outside biology. Coevolution is primarily a biological concept, but has been applied to other fields by analogy. In algorithms. Coevolutionary algorithms are used for generating artificial life as well as for optimization, game learning and machine learning. 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. Daniel Hillis added, co-evolving parasites, to prevent an optimization procedure from becoming stuck at local maxima. 59. Carl Sims co-evolved virtual creatures. 60. In architecture. The concept of coevolution was introduced in architecture by the Danish architect urbanist Henrik Weyler as an antithesis to star architecture. 61. As the curator of the Danish Pavilion at the 2006 Venice Biennale of Architecture, he created an exhibition project on coevolution in urban development in China. It won the Golden Lion for Best National Pavilion. 62, 63, 64, 65. At the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, Newcastle University, a coevolutionary approach to architecture has been defined as a design practice that engages students, volunteers and members of the local community in practical, experimental work aimed at establishing dynamic processes of learning between users and designers. 66. In cosmology and astronomy. In his book The Self-Organizing Universe, Eric Jantz attributed the entire evolution of the cosmos to coevolution. In astronomy, an emerging theory proposes that black holes and galaxies develop in an interdependent way analogous to biological coevolution. 67. In management and organization studies. Since year 2000, a growing number of management and organization studies discuss coevolution and coevolutionary processes. Even so, about Ecology LL. 2020 reveals a prevailing scarcity in explaining what processes substantially characterize coevolution in these fields, meaning that specific analyses about where this perspective on socioeconomic changes, and where it could move toward in the future, are still missing. 68. In sociology. In Development Betrayed, The End of Progress and a Coevolutionary Revisioning of the Future, 1994, 69, Richard Norgaard proposes a coevolutionary cosmology to explain how social and environmental systems influence and reshape each other. 70. In Coevolutionary Economics, The Economy, Society and the Environment, 1994, John Gowdy suggests that the economy, society, and the environment are linked together in a coevolutionary relationship. 71. In technology. Computer software and hardware can be considered as two separate components but tied intrinsically by coevolution. Similarly, operating systems and computer applications, web browsers, and web applications. All these systems depend upon each other and advance through a kind of evolutionary process. Changes in hardware, an operating system or web browser may introduce new features that are then incorporated into the corresponding applications running alongside. 72. The idea is closely related to the concept of joint optimization in socio-technical systems analysis and design, where a system is understood to consist of both a technical system, encompassing the tools and hardware used for production and maintenance, and a social system of relationships and procedures through which the technology is tied into the goals of the system and all the other human and organizational relationships within and outside the system. Such systems work best when the technical and social systems are deliberately developed together. Ecological succession. Ecological succession is the process of change in the species that make up an ecological community over time. Succession after disturbance. A boreal forest 1 year left and 2 years right after a wildfire. The process of succession occurs either after the initial colonization of a newly created habitat, or after a disturbance substantially alters a pre-existing habitat. 1. Succession that begins in new habitats, uninfluenced by pre-existing communities, is called primary succession, whereas succession that follows disruption of a pre-existing community is called secondary succession. 1. Primary succession may happen after a lava flow or the emergence of a new island from the ocean. Surtsey, a volcanic island off the southern coast of Iceland, is an important example of a place where primary succession has been observed. 2. 3. On the other hand, secondary succession happens after disturbance of a community, such as from a fire, severe wind throw, or logging. Succession was among the first theories advanced in ecology. Ecological succession was first documented in the Indiana Dunes of northwest Indiana and remains an important ecological topic of study. 4. Over time, the understanding of succession has changed from a linear progression to a stable climax state, to a more complex, cyclical model that emphasizes the idea of organisms having fixed roles or relationships. 5. History. Precursors of the idea of ecological succession go back to the beginning of the 19th century. As early as 1742, French naturalist Buffon noted that poplars precede oaks and beeches in the natural evolution of a forest. Buffon was later forced by the Theological Committee at the University of Paris to recant many of his ideas because they contradicted the biblical narrative of creation. 6. Swiss geologist Jean-André Deluc and the later French naturalist Adolphe Dureau de la Malle were the first to make use of the word succession concerning the vegetation development after forest clear-cutting. 7. 8. In 1859, Henry David Thoreau wrote an address called The Succession of Forest Trees, 9, in which he described succession in an oak pine forest. It has long been known to observers that squirrels bury nuts in the ground, but I am not aware that anyone has thus accounted for the regular succession of forests. 10. The Austrian botanist Anton Kerner published a study about the succession of plants in the Danube River Basin in 1863. 11. Ragnar Hult's 1885 study on the stages of forest development in Blekinge noted that grassland becomes heath before the heath develops into forest. Birch dominated the early stages of forest development, then pine on dry soil and spruce on wet soil. If the birch is replaced by oak, it eventually develops to beechwood. Swamps proceed from moss to sedges to more vegetation, followed by birch and finally spruce. 6. H.C. Cowles. The Indiana Dunes on Lake Michigan, which stimulated Cowles' development of his theories of ecological succession. Between 1899 and 1910, Henry Chandler Cowles, at the University of Chicago, developed a more formal concept of succession. Inspired by studies of Danish dunes by Eugen Warming, Cowles studied vegetation development on sand dunes on the shores of Lake Michigan, the Indiana Dunes. He recognized that vegetation on dunes of different ages might be interpreted as different stages of a general trend of vegetation development on dunes, an approach to the study of vegetation change later termed space for time substitution, or chronosequence studies. He first published this work as a paper in the Botanical Gazette in 1899, The Ecological Relations of the Vegetation of the Sand Dunes of Lake Michigan. 12. In this classic publication and subsequent papers, he formulated the idea of primary succession and the notion of a sera, a repeatable sequence of community changes specific to particular environmental circumstances. 4. 13. Gleason and Clements. From about 1900 to 1960, however, understanding of succession was dominated by the theories of Frederick Clements, a contemporary of Cowles, who held that seras were highly predictable and deterministic and converged on a climatically determined stable climax community regardless of starting conditions. Clements explicitly analogized the successional development of ecological communities with ontogenetic development of individual organisms, and his model is often referred to as the pseudo-organismic theory of community ecology. Clements and his followers developed a complex taxonomy of communities and successional pathways. Henry Gleason offered a contrasting framework as early as the 1920s. The Gleasonian model was more complex and much less deterministic than the Clementsian. It differs most fundamentally from the Clementsian view in suggesting a much greater role of chance factors and in denying the existence of coherent, sharply bounded community types. Gleason argued that species distributions responded individualistically to environmental factors, and communities were best regarded as artifacts of the juxtaposition of species distributions. Gleason's ideas, first published in 1926, were largely ignored until the late 1950s. Two quotes illustrate the contrasting views of Clements and Gleason. Clements wrote in 1916, "The developmental study of vegetation necessarily rests upon the assumption that the unit or climax formation is an organic entity. As an organism, the formation arises, grows, matures, and dies. Furthermore, each climax formation is able to reproduce itself, repeating with essential fidelity the stages of its development." Frederick Clements 14, while Gleason, in his 1926 paper, said, "An association is not an organism, scarcely even a vegetational unit, but merely a coincidence." Henry Gleason 15. Gleason's ideas were, in fact, more consistent with Cowles' original thinking about succession. About Clements' distinction between primary succession and secondary succession, Cowles wrote 1911. "This classification seems not to be of fundamental value, since it separates such closely related phenomena as those of erosion and deposition, and it places together such unlike things as human agencies and the subsidence of land." Henry Cowles 16. Eugene Odum. In 1969, Eugene Odum published The Strategy of Ecosystem Development, a paper that was highly influential to conservation and environmental restoration. Odum argued that ecological succession was an orderly progression toward a climax state where maximum biomass and symbiotic function between organisms are maintained per unit energy flow. 17. Odum highlighted how succession was not merely a change in the species composition of an ecosystem, but also created change in more complex attributes of the ecosystem, such as structure and nutrient cycling. 18. Modern era. A more rigorous, data-driven testing of successional models and community theory generally began with the work of Robert Whittaker and John Curtis in the 1950s and 1960s. Succession theory has since become less monolithic and more complex. J. Connell and R. Sladier attempted a codification of successional processes by mechanism. Among British and North American ecologists, the notion of a stable climax vegetation has been largely abandoned, and successional processes have come to be seen as much less deterministic, with important roles for historical contingency and for alternate pathways in the actual development of communities. Debates continue as to the general predictability of successional dynamics and the relative importance of equilibrial versus non-equilibrial processes. Former Harvard professor Fakhri A. Bazaz introduced the notion of scale into the discussion, as he considered that at local or small area scale the processes are stochastic and patchy, but taking bigger regional areas into consideration, certain tendencies cannot be denied. 19. More recent definitions of succession highlight change as a central characteristic. 17. New research techniques are greatly enhancing contemporary scientists' ability to study succession, which is now seen as neither entirely random nor entirely predictable. 18. Factors. Ecological succession was formerly seen as having a stable end stage called the climax, sometimes referred to as the potential vegetation, of a site, and shaped primarily by the local climate. This idea has been largely abandoned by modern ecologists in favor of non-equilibrium ideas of ecosystems dynamics. Most natural ecosystems experience disturbance at a rate that makes a climax community unattainable. Climate change often occurs at a rate and frequency sufficient to prevent arrival at a climax state. Additions to available species pools through range expansions and introductions can also continually reshape communities. 20. The development of some ecosystem attributes, such as soil properties and nutrient cycles, are both influenced by community properties, and, in turn, influence further successional development. This feedback process may occur only over centuries or millennia. Coupled with the stochastic nature of disturbance events and other long-term, e.g., climatic changes, such dynamics make it doubtful whether the climax concept ever applies or is particularly useful in considering actual vegetation. 21. The trajectory of successional change can be influenced by initial site conditions, by the type of disturbance that triggers succession, by the interactions of the species present, and by more random factors such as availability of colonists or seeds or weather conditions at the time of disturbance. Some aspects of succession are broadly predictable, others may proceed more unpredictably than in the classical view of ecological succession. Two important perturbation factors today are human actions and climatic change. 22. Though the idea of a fixed, predictable process of succession with a single well-defined climax is an overly simplified model, several predictions made by the classical model are accurate. Species diversity, overall plant biomass, plant lifespans, the importance of decomposer organisms, and overall stability all increase as a community approaches a climax state, while the rate at which soil nutrients are consumed, rate of biogeochemical cycling, and rate of net primary productivity all decrease as a community approaches a climax state. 23. Communities in early succession will be dominated by fast-growing, well-dispersed species, opportunist, fugitive, or R-selected life histories. These are also called pioneer species. As succession proceeds, these species will tend to be replaced by more competitive K-selected species. Some of these trends do not apply in all cases. For example, species diversity almost necessarily increases during early succession as new species arrive, but may decline in later succession as competition eliminates opportunistic species and leads to dominance by locally superior competitors. Net primary productivity, biomass, and trophic properties all show variable patterns over succession, depending on the particular system and site. Types. Primary succession. Successional dynamics beginning with colonization of an area that has not been previously occupied by an ecological community are referred to as primary succession. 1. This includes newly exposed rock or sand surfaces, lava flows, and newly exposed glacial tills. 1. The stages of primary succession include pioneer microorganisms, 24 plants, lichens and mosses, grassy stage, smaller shrubs, and trees. Animals begin to return when there is food there for them to eat. When it is a fully functioning ecosystem, it has reached the climax community stage. 25. Secondary succession. An example of secondary succession by stages. 1. A stable deciduous forest community. 2. A disturbance, such as a wildfire, destroys the forest. 3. The fire burns the forest to the ground. 4. The fire leaves behind empty, but not destroyed, soil. 5. Grasses and other herbaceous plants grow back first. 6. Small bushes and trees begin to colonize the area. 7. Fast-growing evergreen trees develop to their fullest, while shade-tolerant trees develop in the understory. 8. The short-lived and shade-intolerant evergreen trees die as the larger deciduous trees overtop them. The ecosystem is now back to a similar state to where it began. Secondary succession follows severe disturbance or removal of a pre-existing community that has remnants of the previous ecosystem. 1. Secondary succession is strongly influenced by predisturbance conditions such as soil development, seed banks, remaining organic matter, and residual living organisms. 1. Because of residual fertility and pre-existing organisms, community change in early stages of secondary succession can be relatively rapid. 1. Secondary succession is much more commonly observed and studied than primary succession. Particularly common types of secondary succession include responses to natural disturbances such as fire, flood, and severe winds, and to human-caused disturbances such as logging and agriculture. In secondary succession, the soils and organisms need to be left unharmed so there is a way for the new material to rebuild. 9. As an example, in a fragmented old field habitat created in eastern Kansas, woody plants colonized more rapidly per unit area on large and nearby patches. 26. Secondary succession, trees are colonizing uncultivated fields and meadows. Secondary succession can quickly change a landscape. In the 1900s, Acadia National Park had a wildfire that destroyed much of the landscape. Originally evergreen trees grew in the landscape. After the fire, the area took at least a year to grow shrubs. Eventually, deciduous trees started to grow instead of evergreens. 25. Secondary succession has been occurring in Shenandoah National Park following the 1995 flood of the Mormons and Rapidan rivers, which destroyed plant and animal life. 27. Seasonal and cyclic dynamics. Unlike secondary succession, these types of vegetation change are not dependent on disturbance but are periodic changes arising from fluctuating species interactions or recurring events. These models modify the climax concept towards one of dynamic states. Causes of plant succession. Autogenic succession can be brought by changes in the soil caused by the organisms there. These changes include accumulation of organic matter in litter or humic layer, alteration of soil nutrients, or change in the pH of soil due to the plants growing there. The structure of the plants themselves can also alter the community. 28. For example, when larger species like trees mature, they produce shade onto the developing forest floor that tends to exclude light-requiring species. Shade-tolerant species will invade the area. Allogenic succession is caused by external environmental influences and not by the vegetation. For example, soil changes due to erosion, leaching or the deposition of silt and clays can alter the nutrient content and water relationships in the ecosystems. Animals also play an important role in allogenic changes as they are pollinators, seed dispersers and herbivores. They can also increase nutrient content of the soil in certain areas, or shift soil about, as termites, ants, and moles do, creating patches in the habitat. This may create regeneration sites that favor certain species. Climatic factors may be very important, but on a much longer time scale than any other. Changes in temperature and rainfall patterns will promote changes in communities. As the climate warmed at the end of each ice age, great successional changes took place. The tundra vegetation and bare glacial till deposits underwent succession to mixed deciduous forest. The greenhouse effect resulting in increase in temperature is likely to bring profound allogenic changes in the next century. Geological and climatic catastrophes such as volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, avalanches, meteors, floods, fires, and high wind also bring allogenic changes. Mechanisms. In 1916, Frederick Clements published a descriptive theory of succession and advanced it as a general ecological concept. 14. His theory of succession had a powerful influence on ecological thought. Clements' concept is usually termed classical ecological theory. According to Clements, succession is a process involving several phases. 14. 1. Nudation. Succession begins with the development of a bare site, called nudation disturbance. 14. 2. Migration, refers to arrival of propagules. 14. 3. Esosis, involves establishment and initial growth of vegetation. 14. 4. Competition. As vegetation becomes well established, grows, and spreads, various species begin to compete for space, light and nutrients. 14. 5. Reaction. During this phase autogenic changes such as the buildup of humus affect the habitat, and one plant community replaces another. 14. 6. Stabilization. A supposedly stable climax community forms. 14. Seral communities. Aquatic succession or hydrozer, emergent plant life, or pond pioneers, surround an open water lake. Some terrestrial plant life surrounds it as well. B. Emergent plant life begins to move inward and submerge, filling up the lake. Sediment accumulates as the plants grow and die. Terrestrial plant life increases. C. Sediment fills the lake basin, leaving a swampy center at the surface. Terrestrial plants take over and begin to slowly dry out the damp surface. A hydrozer community. A seral community is an intermediate stage found in an ecosystem advancing towards its climax community. In many cases more than one seral stage evolves until climax conditions are attained. 29. A prizer is a collection of seras making up the development of an area from non-vegetated surfaces to a climax community. Depending on the substratum and climate, different seras are found. Changes in animal life. Succession theory was developed primarily by botanists. The study of succession applied to whole ecosystems initiated in the writings of Ramon Margalef, while Eugene Odom's publication of the Strategy of Ecosystem Development is considered its formal starting point. 30. Animal life also exhibits changes with changing communities. In the lichen stage, fauna is sparse. It comprises a few mites, ants, and spiders living in cracks and crevices. The fauna undergoes a qualitative increase during the herb grass stage. The animals found during this stage include nematodes, insect larvae, ants, spiders, mites, etc. The animal population increases and diversifies with the development of the forest climax community. The fauna consists of invertebrates like slugs, snails, worms, millipedes, centipedes, ants, bugs, and vertebrates such as squirrels, foxes, mice, moles, snakes, various birds, salamanders and frogs. A review of succession research by Hodgkinson et al. 2002-31 documented what was likely first noted by Darwin during his voyage on the HMS Beagle. The often repeated description of the stately palm and other Nobel plants, then birds, and lastly man, taking possession of the coral islets as soon as formed in the Pacific, is probably not quite correct. I fear it destroys the poetry of this story, that feather and dirt-feeding and parasitic insects and spiders should be the first inhabitants of newly formed oceanic land. C. Darwin 32. These naturalists note that prior to the establishment of autotrophs, there is a food web formed by heterotrophs built on allochthonous inputs of dead organic matter, necromass. Work on volcanic systems such as Casatochi volcano in the Aleutians by Sykes and Slowick, 2010-33, supports this idea. Microsuccession. Succession of microorganisms including fungi and bacteria occurring within a microhabitat is known as microsuccession or serule. In artificial bacterial metacommunities of modal strains on chip, it has been shown that ecological succession is based on a trade-off between colonization and competition abilities. To exploit locations or explore the landscape. Escherichia coli is a fugitive species, whereas Pseudomonas aeruginosa is a slower colonizer but superior competitor. 7. Like in plants, microbial succession can occur in newly available habitats. Primary succession, such as surfaces of plant leaves, recently exposed rock surfaces i.e., glacial till or animal infant guts. 24. And also on disturbed communities. Secondary succession, like those growing in recently dead trees, decaying fruits. 34. Or animal droppings. Microbial communities may also change due to products secreted by the bacteria present. Changes of pH in a habitat could provide ideal conditions for a new species to inhabit the area. In some cases, the new species may outcompete the present ones for nutrients, leading to the primary species' demise. Changes can also occur by microbial succession with variations in water availability and temperature. Theories of macroecology have only recently been applied to microbiology, and so much remains to be understood about this growing field. A recent study of microbial succession evaluated the balances between stochastic and deterministic processes in the bacterial colonization of a salt marsh chronosequence. The results of this study show that, much like in macrosuccession, early colonization, primary succession, is mostly influenced by stochasticity, while secondary succession of these bacterial communities was more strongly influenced by deterministic factors. 35. Ecological microsuccession in a bacterial metacommunity on chip. A. Sketch of a micron-scale structured bacterial environment based on microfluidics technology. B. Fluorescent microscopy image of Escherichia coli, magenta, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, green, inhabiting a device of the type depicted in A and which has been wetted with growth media and inoculated with both species. C. A sequence of 5 snapshots of the bacterial community distributed over 5 patches, of an array with 85 depicting the spatial dynamics of competition between E. coli, magenta, and P. aeruginosa, green. D. Representation of the succession pattern exhibited by the 2 bacterial species when competing for space and resources in a patchy environment. 7. Climax concept. According to classical ecological theory, succession stops when the sera has arrived at an equilibrium or steady state with the physical and biotic environment. Barring major disturbances, it will persist indefinitely. 1. This endpoint of succession is called climax. Climax community. The final or stable community in a sera is the climax community or climatic vegetation. It is self-perpetuating and in equilibrium with the physical habitat. 1. There is no net annual accumulation of organic matter in a climax community. The annual production and use of energy is balanced in such a community. Characteristics. The vegetation is tolerant of environmental conditions. It has a wide diversity of species, a well-drained spatial structure, and complex food chains. The climax ecosystem is balanced. There is equilibrium between gross primary production and total respiration, between energy used from sunlight and energy released by decomposition, between uptake of nutrients from the soil and the return of nutrient by litter fall to the soil. Individuals in the climax stage are replaced by others of the same kind. Thus the species composition maintains equilibrium. It is an index of the climate of the area. The life or growth forms indicate the climatic type. Types of climax. Climatic climax. If there is only a single climax and the development of climax community is controlled by the climate of the region, it is termed as climatic climax. For example, development of Maple Beach climax community over moist soil. Climatic climax is theoretical and develops where physical conditions of the substrate are not so extreme as to modify the effects of the prevailing regional climate. Adaphic climax. When there are more than one climax communities in the region, modified by local conditions of the substrate such as soil moisture, soil nutrients, topography, slope exposure, fire, and animal activity, it is called adaphic climax. Succession ends in an adaphic climax where topography, soil, water, fire, or other disturbances are such that a climatic climax cannot develop. Catastrophic climax. Climax vegetation vulnerable to a catastrophic event such as a wildfire. For example, in California, chaparral vegetation is the final vegetation. The wildfire removes the mature vegetation and decomposers. A rapid development of herbaceous vegetation follows until the shrub dominance is re-established. This is known as catastrophic climax. Disclimax. When a stable community, which is not the climatic or adaphic climax for the given site, is maintained by man or his domestic animals, it is designated as disclimax, disturbance climax, or anthropogenic subclimax, man-generated. For example, overgrazing by stock may produce a desert community of bushes and cacti where the local climate actually would allow grassland to maintain itself. Subclimax. The prolonged stage in succession just preceding the climatic climax is subclimax. Preclimax and postclimax. In certain areas different climax communities develop under similar climatic conditions. If the community has life forms lower than those in the expected climatic climax, it is called preclimax. A community that has life forms higher than those in the expected climatic climax is postclimax. Preclimax strips develop in less moist and hotter areas, whereas postclimax strands develop in more moist and cooler areas than that of surrounding climate. Theories. There are 3 schools of interpretations explaining the climax concept. Monoclimax or climatic climax theory was advanced by Clements 1916, and recognizes only one climax whose characteristics are determined solely by climate, climatic climax. The processes of succession and modification of environment overcome the effects of differences in topography, parent material of the soil, and other factors. The whole area would be covered with uniform plant community. Communities other than the climax are related to it, and are recognized as subclimax, postclimax and disclimax. Polyclimax theory was advanced by Tansley 1930.